Welcome to the Stoa. Today we have the integral Renaissance man himself, Layman Pascal, joining us. And today's session is called Apocalyptarians. This was based off a Substack, a fire Substack post that Layman wrote. And I love kind of sensing into an article that has a lot of energy in it, like Joe Lightfoot's Liminal Web. And then this one had a lot of energy to it, and I think that surprised even Layman himself. And I'll let him explain what it is about, but it's sort of leaning in to the meta crisis, the great weirding, the apocalypse that perhaps we are in. So how today's going to work, I'm going to take in Layman in a moment. He's going to share his thoughts, and then we'll pivot to a Q&A. So if you have questions anytime, put in the chat, and I'll call on you. You can ask Layman your question. So that being said, welcome back to the Stoa, my friend.
Yeah, nice to see you, Peter. Nice to see everybody here. Looking forward to this. I think it's going to be a lot of fun. There's a lot of darkness and ambiguity built into this theme, but I think the whole thing we're trying to do here is get more comfortable and have a better time with that. Okay. I'm Layman Pascal, and to quote Andrew Sweeney, I seem to be around. Something like an ambient interlocutor and meta-theoretical leprechaun caught in the liminal web. So the question, can we even think the disaster in whose foyer we already stand? Crisis as hyperobject. Crisis as meta-crisis of confluent crises. Nested inside a perverse logic underwriting even our promising functional and aspirational systems. Death for each and death-like upheaval for all. The end of things and the mood of the end of things, and how do we live in a looming ontological limit condition that is undetermined in its particulars and variable from moment to moment and location to location. Time to not just start talking about inhabiting the great weirding, time also to bring the weird. It's time to practice the thing to which we are already being subjected. So the story is this. I've got a Substack. I answer questions people ask because I like my writing to be dialogical. Recently, people were interested in this apocalyptarian article that combines an obscure piece of Gurdjieff's teaching with the idea that we both are and are not fucked, world historically speaking. We are already inside several kinds of apocalypse, some of which are external disruptions and some of which are the Terence McKenna-like intensifications of the uncanny. And we absolutely should be devoting our energies to building new systems and navigating around or reversing as many of these factors as possible, but we won't get them all. We also have to inhabit this current and emerging world. We also have to live in and be newly indigenous within the apocalypse and the intractability, just as we have to sink into sex, death, frustration, grief, and impossibility in ourselves in order to grow the roots that will make our spirituality and our efforts in the world more authentic and less of a naive techno-optimism about tidying everything up and getting a pat on the head from the spirit of history. Now, I think people connected with this article for a couple of reasons. Firstly, a lot of folks suspect they do not understand as much Gurdjieff as they should, which is true. Secondly, our communities are looking for a tone or a mood or a spirit that reconciles whatever Schmachtenberger and Bard variously stand for, a mood that brings metamodernism and hella-metamodernism back together, a mood that affords us both the shared virtue-oriented intersubjective reasoning of dialogos and the Reichian Lacanian surrealist dive into Hegelian contradiction, asymmetry, terminality, body, madness, and darkness. And thirdly, I think we're all a little bit proud and curious about the idea that we meta-integrative liminal Stoics, we punk Vervaekians and trans non-dualistic reconstructionists are the sign of an emerging adaptation to the new conditions. There is something going on this planet, half archaic and half novel, that is definitely going to drive people insane, but it might also feed our kind of souls. It's going to amplify the classic human stupidity where we polarize into reciprocal groups of misinformed fools who attack each other for being misinformed fools while trashing the artifacts of wisdom culture. But this same instability, this pressure, this same high weirdness is potentially surfable. We have some of the skills to do this job. And if we pay attention, we might even be able to get better at it, although we'll always be imperfect. The imminent future, short to midterm, the rest of the 21st century is a dream. It's a little bit nightmare, a little bit sex fantasy, a little bit alien encounter, a little bit revelation, and a lot of surrealistic strangeness. I think we, all of us here, and our brothers and sisters and intersexed cousins are arguably the largest, smartest, most tuned in quasi group of rationally informed, spiritually practicing, metacognitive, hemisphere integrating, international cabal of weirdos on the planet. So if we can't do it, maybe nobody can. And hell, maybe we can. So let's put that on a hat. You might know that I'm encouraging a group called Ontario Depth Adaptation, which I consider to be somewhat analogous to the spirit of this article. It's a tiny seedling right now, but it plays into everything I've been saying. The name is a combination of Jem Bendel's deep adaptation discourse with the notion of depth that's privileged in developmental metaspaces, and thirdly, the name of the Canadian province that myself and an oddly large number of players in the liminal web live in. And the idea is to put embodied bioregional eco-localism, the half-comprehensible world we live and die in, at the center of the mandala. And I've proposed there something I'm not personally capable of, which is that my people, integralists, meta-theorists, syntheists, game beehives, meta-modernists, should be spending at least half their time thinking on real projects, from grieving to energy systems, from sex to disaster preparation, from paying each other to improving our gut bacteria on the ground. I love the free-floating community of my peers online, but it only takes one solar flare and the internet goes away. I love that I can fly down to present at Brendan Graham Dempsey's Metamodern Spirituality Retreat in May, but the borders can close at any time and for God knows how long. Maybe it's 30 years next time. Sooner or later, there's going to be disruption, and the world becomes the people who you can drive or walk to visit, people with the same borders as you, people with roughly the same geography and ecosystem as you. We don't know when or what's coming, but it's coming. It's coming just as inevitably as your death or your aggression or your perverse sexual imaginings or your realization that you've been an asshole to people. So we need to be seriously setting up things that benefit us, whether the systems are stable or not. We need to build and inhabit a time between worlds. We need fundamentally to be creating mutual support networks and educational experiments and art and wealth and health building teams that can help us flourish together and evolve the system when it's operating, and help us survive and thrive and promote our kind of insights when the system is periodically massively destabilized and pervaded by the thick ambience of the preposterous or the terrible. And we need to do this with a high degree of vitality and artistry and nuance, and without getting caught in attractive synoptic idealisms that hide rather than reveal the energies that need to be integrated. If we're prepared for it, it could be great for us. If we're not prepared, then trauma is trauma, and all our meditation and online friends and great insights into the possibilities of new civilization will be dragged out into the street and shot. So we're fucked, but also maybe we can do this. And the this that we've got to do is simultaneously in the context of a world that works and doesn't work, a world in which we can build new systems, and a world in which we require the resilience and depth that comes from inhabiting the darkness of system failures, the reality of hidden patterns, the obviousness of overwhelm, and the inevitable incompleteness of the one. So I'm going to read the article I wrote, and then I'll say a couple more things about these themes, and then we'll all chat. So this was the prompt. Somebody asked me if I'm optimistic about the future. It's a very obvious question, and it therefore deserves, in my mind, a very indirect answer. So I wrote this. If you have not read and reread Gurdjieff's arcane, hilarious, and profound megatext of 1930s sci-fi religion, The Tales of Beelzebub to His Grandson, then I will point out just one of its many strangenesses. The devil, a wise, God-loving alien from Galactic Central who lives on Mars with his extended family in a fancy telescope, describes for his grandson the sacred cosmic law of Sulionensius. Sulionensius is an unavoidable condition of intensified peculiarity resulting from interstellar tension. Just as you might get weirded out by another person walking too close to you on the sidewalk, our beloved sun enters into these tense, exacerbated proximities with other solar systems. The solar agitation ripples through the Gaian biosphere of the Earth as an ambient wave of uncanny cosmic striving. Normally, as happens on most of the other planets of our galaxy, this period of accelerated strangeness creates the Ia effect. It turns up the volume on Eros. Sane beings on other planets eagerly await this periodic phenomenon. They look forward to the spontaneous acceleration of their organic religiousness, their being striving for acquiring objective reason and the rapid self-perfecting of three-brained beings. In other words, it amplifies the urge of evolutionary enlightenment. Sounds good, but there's a problem. Our terrestrial civilization is fucked in this story. We live in ways that sabotage the development of organic conscience and depth of being, and as a result, we cannot assimilate the extra energy of Sulionensius. The Ia Buliunosar effect does not do its job on this planet. And as the wave of cosmic pressure moves through our biosphere, we do not recognize or integrate its power. Instead, we have a weird collective unconscious reaction. We feel upset, polarized. We feel something big has to change. We want to mobilize. We want to urgently improve ourselves and society. We know there's a dramatic insufficiency that must be corrected in order to avoid some kind of despair. And this is particularly evident in the book when Beelzebub describes visiting Russia in the guise of rising Bolshevism. A mass formation of collective psychosis erupts around class. Members of the mainstream governing bureaucracies become hysterical, conformist mandarins, while anti-government agitators erupt from every corner. War and civil war become all too easy. Leaders become dissociated and anti-leaders swarm into view. The social fabric shreds as people take sides, whose outcome can only be the destruction of our inherited possibilities of health, freedom, and wisdom. He says sensitivity and foresight vanish. The natural cosmic religious mobilization urge is deflected into the narratives of the social surface. Sounds familiar. Putting Gurdjieff's iconoclastic mythology aside, we can probably agree that we are collectively facing some kind of apocalypse. The planetary tension is high. A so-called meta-crisis of confluent radical disruptions of biology and civilization has already begun. And the ordinary question, can we do anything about it, has to be supplemented with the extraordinary question, can we consciously assimilate this weirdness or not? These can be hard words. There's a small voice of sanity in the back of our minds that points out that any particular model of the future may be incorrect, and that we certainly cannot agree with the unstable lack of rigor found in doomsday conspiracy theorists. That's very true. But today there are very many truly radical possibilities in play over the next few decades, and honestly, it only takes one. Our ice caps are rapidly melting. There are huge reserves of greenhouse gases that could accelerate global climate destabilization. The Amazon rainforest, still being deliberately burned, is outputting more carbon than it absorbs. Oceanographers point to the simultaneous acidification of the seas and an imminent tipping point for cascading die-offs in marine species. And at the very same moment, we are building artificial intelligences, self-driving cars, flying killer robots, and disturbingly lifelike sex dolls. Our pocket computers are monitoring us with special algorithms that deliberately erode attention, break up social bonds, and generate addictive stress, and everyone knows about it. We can design the genetics of babies now. The location of nuclear weapons is getting harder to track. Natural and artificial pandemics are circulating. Deepfake technology means that audio, video, and photographic evidence now prove nothing. At least one of your online friends is a piece of software. At least one of the social groups important to you was created by a distant cybernetic troll farm that deliberately wants to radicalize you. Our democratic legislatures are unresponsive to the will of the people. Wild animals are already full of microplastics and strange hormones. Everyone is taking multiple mood-altering drugs. 3D printed guns can't be detected at airports. The tools for bioweapons are spreading. The most beautiful places in the world are constantly on fire. The sacred sites are overrun. We're moving to settle Mars. Computers can defeat us at all games. And according to the Pentagon, UFOs might be back in the picture. That's now. And I bet you could add a half dozen more things to this list. So the problem of being good apocalyptarians becomes an important existential question. The old question is, will there be an apocalypse or not? And the new question is, how do we live under the conditions of the apocalyptic mood? We are not only postmodern now, but in a perverse way, we are post-futurist. Many things that seem like science fiction have already happened. Robots defeating humans at Jeopardy, chess, and Go, that's the past. Reality TV star Donald Trump becomes president of the most powerful nation on earth. Babies without sex, sex without babies, artificial limbs, global pandemics. That's the past already. We need to try to take that seriously, try to inhabit the current and emerging world. It is some kind of end of history, or Kali Yuga, or McKenna's hyperdimensional object at the end of time. It's weird, it's really weird, and it's going to get weirder. Don't waste a second pretending you're going back to normal. Sure, many disrupted things can and should be reestablished, but the looming sense of crisis, the surrealistic mood, the collective stress, the hyper novelty, the polarization, it's not going away. It'll roll on from one strange ambient crisis to the next. We are like those fictional earthlings facing Beelzebub's Sulionensius. We have strayed into a time between worlds in which some extra charge of peculiar transformational crisis is our background condition. Either we can work with it, or else we are driven to self-destructive suppressions and revolutions at the social surface, and probably both will happen. If you follow my Substack or read this on Emerge or participate in one or more of the liminal web communities, then there's a good chance you can be an apocalyptarian. I believe in you. You have a higher than normal likelihood of being able to surf the ultra peculiarity, assimilate the revolutionary ambience, and transmute the world historical urgency into wisdom, discipline, and freedom. You have a better than average capacity to handle ontological flooding. However, most folks are not like you. Across this country and around the world, even in your own family, people will be slipping into reciprocal forms of mass psychosis, self-sabotage, and recoil. They will unthinkingly associate the ambient world mood with a desperate or depressive desire to take a side and to start fixing the problem represented to them by their fellow citizens. They will become open to the idea of abandoning classical virtues without even noticing they're doing it, squashing the deplorables, denouncing the intellectuals, doubling down on what doesn't work. Important chunks of society will mobilize against other important chunks of society, and everywhere no one will be doing their job. All over, we should expect that despite various good cultivation projects that are producing healthy, sane, and super-informed people, we will see waves of irrational, obscene conformists trying to penalize, oppress, or destroy people who they think are irrational, obscene conformists. The uncanny ripples moving through the biosphere and noosphere are getting louder. It is the same ancient nonsense we have periodically strayed through, but it is accelerating with new tools in its hands. While we work as we should to mitigate these effects and course correct our civilization, we must also learn to lean into those qualities and skills that will make us more likely to be good citizens of the apocalypse. We are and need to be apocalyptarians. And it will feel and really be better than if we don't. And we already kind of know who we are. People with complex, unique integrations, people who are never exactly on any of the sides, people good at embodiment and nuance and looking for deeper dialogue, people trying to bring ancient spiritual practice and new science together, postmodernists, sincerely ironic evolutionary in-betweeners. These are the people who might be able to use the mood of the multi-apocalypse as fuel rather than as some form of short circuit into reactive pro-narrative or anti-narrative social nonsense. It could be great. Amazing and wonderful things are going to happen. But don't be fooled. Most folks will probably go the other way. And they will not only have guns, they will have both the mainstream and alternative media, the banks, the NGOs, the main political parties, the algorithms, and both sides of every mass formation mobilization. And they will feel sincerely or rabidly that they are finally on the verge of solving a great problem represented by all the unreasonable bad people who have been eroding the value of civilization. And they are so close to being correct. There is a great problem. We do have an urgent need to mobilize. There is something radical and restorative that must be done. We just need to be able to put that feeling in the right place. So that was the article, and we might want to say a few more words about inhabiting and transmuting apocalypses. Apocalypses are fascinating to me, and it goes without saying that eschatology is a nuanced business. If you've seen the HBO television series Rome, there's a hilarious moment where Prince Herod is coming from Jerusalem on a diplomatic mission, and the news guy, the orator who makes public pronouncements in the town square in Rome, proclaims a special imperial edict that for the duration of the political visit, there shall be, quote, no making fun of the Jews and their one God. right? And that's humorous if we grow up in a culture that still inherits the idea that Judaic, Christian, and Islamic monotheism are somehow the normal examples of mythic membership religion. But from the point of view of the so-called pagans, that extended Judaic lineage may be extremely truncated, an incomplete way to view the full pantheonics of the sacred mandala. And just like the gods are reduced to one god, the millennial cycles of pagan mythic empires are often reduced to one cyclic age in the monotheistic book cults. So the normal religious thought is of several thousand years, leading to catastrophic transitions into the next cycle in an endless sequence. But the book cults truncate that process. They zero in on just one cycle, starting roughly with the beginning of writing under the aegis of the author king via the one book, moving up and down until people finally cease to obey the framework of the narrative and the world is destroyed with a terminal finality. Revelation, apocalypse, the end times. So what I'm pointing to is that apocalypse has this ambiguity about whether it is an end or a transition, a rupture or a reset, a leap out of time or an instance of megatime, a removal of what we count upon, or at last the coming forth of what René Girard calls the things hidden since the beginning of the world. It also has this ambiguity between whether it consists of specific objective disruptions or a particular accumulating mood. We see the external trends. Some of them, and perhaps a few others we don't even know about, will almost certainly come to pass, but they are accompanied by and sometimes outshined by this McKenna-esque sense of vexatious ultra-peculiarity. He used to say people think they're just having a bad hair day. Something's a little off. They don't get that it's the retroactive ingression of novelty from the temporal black hole that all history is falling into and the digital DMT mushroom elves are trying to prepare us to handle. That kind of thing. Abnormality is the new norm, the habituation of novelty. A Stephen Wolfram world of push-button surprises, harnessing the endless unpredictability of complex but deterministic computational patterns that mostly fall outside of our brain's capacity to simplify and recognize. And we are sliding into that outside already. Like Hanzi's recent attempt to make general developmental historical phases line up with Feigenbaum's periodicity of bifurcation doubling, we may need to think of metamodernity as both the site of the clarification of developmental stages and the threshold at which schemas of transformation can no longer be usefully tracked. A transmimetic chaos whose overall attractor state is an ongoing revolution of the new norm, and this will either burn us out or call forth those who can treat this kind of chaos as their kind of stability, their kind of habitat for thriving. Who does that require us to be? It's like the Beatles have been playing twist and shout for a few thousand years, but they're currently in the studio recording Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band with Aleister Crowley on the cover. The zeitgeist is not found in the technocratic speculations of Davos or Silicon Valley or Beijing. It's closer to what Hunter Thompson would describe as the first rising waves of an acid trip. It is coming on us in waves, giving our bloodstream the first unsettling tastes of a trip that is already starting and to which we are already existentially committed. To misquote another Canadian, the apocalypse is already here, it's just not evenly spread out. The temperature is rising on the Kali Yuga thermostat. It's not a China problem. It's not an anti-vaxxer problem. It's not a Trump problem. These are symptoms. Electing the old or young Joe Bidens will not save us. Moderate centrist corporatist bureaucracies listening to their institutional experts, misreading their biased polling data, and trying to enforce a helpful compromise narrative is the very thing that splits the world and summons the rough beast toward Bethlehem. And once normality itself becomes a weirdness accelerator, you get a cascading uncanniness that will feel like the stability of all contextualization is in question. As much as we'd like the time between worlds to quickly get to the next world, we're going to be living for a while inside the feeling of the interregnum, the twilight zone, the moment the VR goggles come off and you have to reorient in the parallax of perspectives. Time between worldsness is the niche to which we must adapt now. And that adaptation is a mixture of new systems born from new technological and scientific insights that outperform and to some degree extend our legacy institutions. But it's also the Zizekian Lacanian deep dive into the psychoanalytic dark night of the Hegelian soul. And it's also the vivid informational opacity that surrealists and Zen masters and shamans have been pointing toward. And like them, we can get better at living in this terrain. And consider me a cheerleader for that. I feel like a new indigeneity is necessary. We are like the first people of a new civilization, like the fish coming out of the water onto the land, and we must sink into this new reality, smell it, taste it, map it, get lost and found in it, try things, put down roots, taste the vegetation, watch the new seasons change, dream the myths of this new land, inspired by our predecessors, and fully aware of the dangers that lurk in all complex new territories and in all mythos. But what's more gorgeous than all that impermanence? The doctrine of presence is not just to show up without a mental narrative in the present moment. It is to bring all your parts forward with your instinctively chosen partners and perform the act of inhabiting more and more completely and uniquely a world that is simultaneously what it has always been and something completely different. A disconcerting beam has fallen upon this world. We've got to feel it into all of our segments and into all of our hidden systems. Yes, we have to make sense of and build new things and steer as best we can. But if we don't do that with a more explicit demonstration of the strangenesses that we normally marginalize and suppress in ourselves, then we will miscalculate and fall back under the sway of the very regimes we are trying to outdo. That means that back to normal is, in a way, the ideology of our bipartisan adversaries. The liberal bureaucratic centrist sentiment is usually that we can manage or regulate our way back to the compromise-based incremental improvement trajectory prior to whatever is assumed to be the current source of the strange behavior. COVID, misinformation, Trump, the unregulated internet, etc. And the mainstream centrist conservatives think we can get back to a legendary normal, the 1950s, the 1300s, the kingdom of Atlantis, some time when virtue training and stereotypes afforded enough homogeneity to handle diversity and chaos. But these are, to me, two arms of one system: industrial, socialist, capitalist, romantic, left brain TV and newspaper marketing thinking in its slightly more urban, institutional, and slightly more rural populist forms. The system is not imposing a narrative against which you can fight. It's a boxing promoter getting paid when the fight happens. So I have nothing against creating a future by pretending it's a return to our original condition. But the kind of people who hear themselves named in this article, the citizens of liminal webs, we apocalyptarians, have to sidestep this ambidextrous call to premature renormalization and accelerate our adaptation to the end times incongruities that will pervade both the stable and destabilized variants of the day after tomorrow. And we are close allies, of course, with the complexity theorists who understand catastrophic risk and anti-fragility. We are close allies with big picture and big history philosophical integrators. We are cousins to the people committed to meta-progressive political change and new tech and new currency and new educational systems and neurobiologically vetted yogic living. And these things can and should make a big difference. But there's something more. There's a level of heartbreak necessary to become trans pessimists. There's a post-doom awakening that facilitates our adaptation and energizes our creative mobilization. There's a shadow, there's a failure, there's a perversion, there's nonsense, and we have to open to and pass into it if we're going to find the instincts that maximize empowerment in this world that is the short to midterm extension of trends that are already in place and accelerating. And there's no reason all of that can't be sexy and smart and edifying and transformative and lovely and holy and robust. So who do you have to be? Who do we have to be in order to be the thriving inhabitants of the apocalypse? Let's open that question and take it seriously. Amen.
All right, how was that?
Leaving a round of applause, everyone. That was fucking awesome. That was brilliant. And I really appreciate it because the original article was a piece of art, and you came to the Stoa and you created new art from that. So yeah, I appreciate you doing that, my friend. So let's open up the space for some Q&A. If you need to take a moment, because that was quite psychoactive, feel free to close off your camera and take a breath. And if you have any questions, start putting it in the chat. So maybe I'll warm you up with an exchange, Layman. Yeah, the phrase, the construct, apocalyptic mood, I think that just boom hits it. And this like back to normal cope, It's really just like a felt sense, like, oh yeah, it's just like this comfy normality is going to return or whatever. Um, it's like saying goodbye to that. And when I had my moment when I said goodbye to that, that's like just things shifted. And then leaning to this apocalyptic mood, I think is quite important. But I'm curious, like this, like going crazy and being comfortable with going crazy. Because when I kind of like this have this a psychoactive experience, it's like my map or logical space gets expanded too quickly, and then the emotional space, the corresponding emotional space, is like bumping into unmet emotions that are like dark, scary, and if that happens too fast, then like the crazy emerges. But I went crazy so many times, so I got my reps in, and I'm like comfortable with this, and I sense you are as well. Um, and so, how do you think that is that kind of like that art of going crazy in the right way can make us good apocalyptarians?
It's interesting. I love that you brought it up that way because there's a wisdom to it, right? It's not just, you can't just choose madness. What we're really talking about is going back and forth between different kinds of moods and states and processing systems and risking the emotion that arises at the threshold, right? And a lot of the time, it's not really about actually going crazy. It's about going to the edge of crazy where those emotions are triggered that make you want to go back to a normalcy. So I think the best thing we can do is build up to it slowly, right? You don't want to traumatize somebody. And I think what we're going to see in the world is a lot of people who can't handle this increase are going to respond to it as if it's a trauma. And in order to make sure we don't get traumatized, we have to not overload ourselves. So we have to like titrate the overload. You got to touch as much of it as you can. You have to want to touch more of it, but don't break yourself, you know. Watch how babies learn. It's bit by bit. And it's overwhelming and you have to stop and pull back. But if you have the general frame of going further into that, then you'll be able to make incremental progress in that area.
Yeah, yeah. And the construct I like is ontological shock. And then once you experience enough of it yourself, you can have like a discernment and sensitivity when someone's getting to that edge there. And it's kind of like, like, let's be delicate. Um, and what was the other thing I wanted to ask you? Oh, yeah, yeah. So my sense is that this piece was influenced or inspired by the meeting of energies, if you will, in the liminal web, the kind of the game B meta modern, and then the dark renaissance. And both of those things, I think you and I both agree that need to be honored. But I'm curious if that meeting here at the Stoa and elsewhere, how that inspired this piece.
Yeah, it's interesting because these are themes that everybody recognizes, right? We're all over the map on these things. But lately there's been a special call from some of the people in our communities to lean into these themes more. It's been coming out of the deep web and the dark renaissance, also the hell meta-monism thing. Like, how can we add a little bit more insanity, a little more chaos, a little more embrace of the repressed and the dark and the hidden and the non-conscious? I think we're also hearing from a lot of our better spiritual thinkers about the need to grieve better. Conversations I've been having with Raveki are largely been around the grieving the death of God lately, things like that. So there's this sense of letting down, of falling, and I think we're hearing our fellows call out for that. And I don't think that's random. I think they're saying that this is a moment in which we have to lean into that a little bit more to get the balance right, to make sure that the projects we're all working on don't become contaminated by the implicit game A logic that somehow refuses its own psychoanalytical darkness. So I have a feeling that probably a lot of us have, that clearly these are not opposites, right? You listen to Schmachtenberg, oh yeah, you listen to Barty, oh yeah, okay. Both of them seem valuable, and we have to be able to get better at holding that mixture and articulating the voice of the people who find those to be really complementary and aspects of the same thing.
Mm-hmm. And kind of like speaking, getting to the practical, you created the Ontario Adaptation Group, which I'm a part of, Deep Adaptation Group. And, it's just starting. So we're trying to figure out like kind of like how to like, do this together. And it seems like the two bad or fucked up attractors of the meta crisis is collapse and totalitarianism, or like what the prepper community calls like without rule of law or an excessive rule of law. And and it seems like getting the capacity and talent stack to prepare for both of those things while being oriented towards, you know, a more quote unquote heavenly way of being. And so any sense of how to do that together on the ground in a group such as the one you created?
I don't think we know. I think fundamentally, we have to make some kind of emotional change, which is part of what this article calls out for, right? I'm looking at it going, yeah, it's clearly I need to be putting a lot more effort into the Tristan Harris kind of stuff where we're actually trying to build systems in a way that they don't fall into the attractor of authoritarianism or chaos. But at the same time, there's going to be authoritarianism and chaos. There's going to be disruptions. So how do I prepare for those? I'm clearly not preparing for those things anywhere nearly as much as I should. Why is it getting a tiny fraction of my attention? There's some kind of emotional resistance in most of us to taking that as seriously as it needs to be taken in terms of thinking out how we actually establish networks and resources, how we become intelligent liminal preppers, both for a world that might work better and the worlds that aren't going to work very well for us that are also somewhat inevitable. And we don't know, like it's all experimental at this point. Like by calling it out, naming it, trying to feel into it, and challenging ourselves to go through the emotional shift that might be necessary to make that more of a reality for us. I think that's the first step.
Mm. And you know, I'm going to look if there's any questions in the chat. I think you stunned everyone at the ontological shock. But if you have any questions, throw them in the chat. And maybe I'll warn Layman with one more. This is like almost an aside, but I think it's related. It's like, what's up with Ontario? Because there's all these like autodidactic kind of like, you know, bespoke sense makers here. And then a lot of like culture war events happen here, you know, from like slut walk to like this, what's happening right now with the trucker convoy. So any read that you have, I know we talked about this when I came on your podcast, but any kind of additional read that you have of why this is the case?
Well, it's an interesting location. I mean, it's first of all, it's huge. So a lot of things can go on here. Second of all, it's the center of the Canadian enterprise, and the Canadian enterprise is an offset from the American enterprise. So it's a lot of people here have the benefits of the psychology and systems and social approach that the Americans are going through, but with enough distance not to be totally living that out. So it's a space where you would expect people to be pretty intelligent, pretty open, very aware of what's going on, with a little bit of a cooler distance to observe it. And I think there's up till now been a very strong sense of goodness and collaboration in this country, which has given us the background to try a bunch of weird experiments, right? Like I think about Kids in the Hall and that kind of comedy styling where like you trust the world enough that you can try some really extreme experiments that might be unraveling, but it's fascinating. I'm not totally sure why. I mean, I moved out here a few years ago. So it's the land of my fathers, but I was surprised to start realizing how many of the people I'm talking to actually are in this same area. So naming that and thinking about that and having everybody else try to do the same. The point of Ontario depth adaptation is not that everyone should move to Ontario, although maybe they should. The point is for everybody to start thinking, who is in my liminal network, who's actually nearby, who's in the same geography, who's in the same region as me? Do I have any sense of what the actual on the ground regional version of the liminal web is going to be when and if something happens?
Yeah. And it reminds me of what Jason Snyder and I talked about when COVID first came online. Is like we need sort of like a meta tribe so we can kind of make sense of all this, but we also need a kinetic tribe, and then maybe they're both closer than we think. So we do have a few doomer optimists in the room here. And Jason, you have a statement question. Can I take you in?
Hey, Layman. Big fan of your work. Thought this was a brilliant presentation. I realized I needed to check in with my body a few times, and that's when I know it's a good presentation. Yeah, so, I was attracted to this, the title and the article, because, we have come with this kind of playful embrace of this term doomer optimism, which I think has a similar sensibility. I think what you're presenting is more psychedelic, which I like, and I definitely appreciate. And I'm interested in I like especially what you said just at the end there of finding your region, One might say finding their bioregion if they want to be kind of ecologically informed. And so I'm curious about your own experience of kind of embracing, integrating this kind of accelerating psychedelic strangeness while also grounding it in personal embodiment practices, but also in resilient and regenerative communities of actually, creating the platform for the transition, from crumbling world order into birthing something new.
Well, hi, and that's huge. For me, the question of and the principle of getting better at inhabiting is sort of common to all of these things. Like we need to show up more in our lives and in our communities and in our local ecologies. And clearly the ways that we've been doing that have been insufficient. Like, do we really go out and smell and touch and eat the plants that even live in our region? Like there's a lot of unconscious elements of inhabitation that we haven't been taking advantage of, and that our ancestors took centuries or millennia to do in their own niches, but we have to be able to do that much faster. So we need to be more conscious and more intentional about trying to do multidimensional, multi-intelligence inhabitation. And we need to be able to do that psychologically as well as physiologically, as well as socially, as well as technologically. And psychologically, part of that is going into strange spaces of mind, right? And that can be spiritual practice, that can be surrealism, that can be psychedelics. But there are a lot of accessible, well-known regions of mind that we could all get to. And it's not enough to just get there. We have to become dwellers in that space to some degree. We have to open the bridges between these modes more aptly. So when you have psychedelic experience, process it, talk about it, access it on multiple systems, draw it out, try to do what McKenna did so well, which is attempt to do a fairly reasonable, rational articulation of it. Of course, you're going to fail, but the very attempt is going to allow you to be more of an inhabitant of those spaces. And I think we have to do something like that psychedelically, mystically, and eco-technologically.
Any follow-up shares, Jason?
No, I thought that was good. I think, yeah, no, this is a lifetime practice of finding traction, psychological traction in the earth, in the body, and creating something physical, actually physical structures from these psychedelic explorations. That seems to be the work. So
the thing I point to a lot is to think about a generalized notion of what shamans were doing in proto-historical systems, right? They're taking substances to alter their consciousness, but they're not all just taking DMT. They're also just eating the plants and seeing how that affects them. And a lot of what they're doing is elemental immersion with their somatic system, right? That we need to be in the wind, in the rain, touching the trees, putting our feet in the dirt, tasting things, touching them, doing the Wim Hof thing. If you've got ice around, go out in the ice. Whatever you've got around, go out and allow your body to be impacted by it. Because a lot of the adaptation and a lot of the learning and a lot of the showing up is not going to be done by your conscious thinking brain. It's going to be done by your whole system under the intensities of whatever the local elementals are.
Yeah, that's real good. Thank you, Jason. So we're gonna just be here 30 minutes after the hour, so 90 minutes in total. And we'll continue with the Q&A, and we'll take in the mama bear of the Doomer optimism movement, Ashley. Ashley, I believe you had a share.
Yeah, I have so much to say, like I don't even there's so much that resonates with what Jason and I have been doing. I'm having a hard time relating to focus on part of one of the comments I was making is to try, okay, so there's so much disorienting going on right now. And I wonder whether or not psychedelics or spiritual practices could be one tool, but I think in combination with maybe literally the practical realities of existence, building community, for me and Jason, a lot of what we recommend is homesteading or learning how to keep chickens or this kind of thing. as like I was saying, we need to seek out more normie stuff as a way to like reorient ourselves. But then people were saying like, what do you mean by normie? And I'm like, well, I guess the project is to find your like normie existence as a way to reorient yourself to like the embodied, the human scale, the like proven social norms. Like, so I think there is a hesitation on my part in some ways to like go too far in the direction of the psychedelic and like, you know, standing in the snow like Wim Hof, like, you know, I feel like maybe I'm the person who's trying to tell people, you know, find some like version of normal life and experiment with it, see what works with you. It doesn't have to be the same as other people's. It could be like what makes sense in your context with your community, building community, learning like the practicalities of building community. I have these religious people who come, I live in Uruguay, come to Uruguay every year. And every time I go over to their place, they have like this potluck and everybody's got enough food. Like they just pick your kid up and hold them. Like everybody's doing community well there. And I just feel like, you know, there are ways in which we can learn how to do like normie community stuff that's not like so introspective and navel gazing. I don't know. I guess like I'm just free associating, but I'd like to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I think, I mean, the way I think about that is in terms of subtleties and intensities, right? You know, after enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. So there's a lot of state change things we can explore. There's a lot of some psychedelic philosophy, strange communities and things we can explore. But there's also these very subtle elements of what are we eating every day? How are we holding each other? What are we doing physically with objects? Do we know who our neighbors are? And those things are both physical and sociological. I think we have to keep that in mind because I know some people who their idea of prepping is they've got a bunker and some food and a gun and some gasoline, which is fine. Those things might be important, but they are going to be dramatically outdone by social adaptation because humans get together with other humans. Very often other humans they don't necessarily like or want to hang out with, right? And that ability to go and interact with and work with people who you don't necessarily want to spend time with, or to be part of systems that emerge, right? Like anybody who's seen any of the zombie apocalypse fiction understands there's quite a possibility that any disruption is going to create some kind of sociological strangeness. Maybe it looks like it's medieval, or maybe it looks like it's the ongoing stale bureaucracy, or maybe it looks more authoritarian or more chaotic. We have to socially be able to work with people in any of these circumstances, first of all, to get anything done just in the regular element of our life. And then second of all, to think about how that life becomes healthier and more robust and prepares a future and satisfies us. And then thirdly, how that can incorporate all of these other dimensions. So we have to have some way of moving back and forth between all these things. We can't feel a strong dichotomy between practical daily local action and the extreme ranges of psychological and philosophical experience. Right? And one of the things that's been difficult in trying to get the Ontario depth adaptation and analogous projects that everybody could be setting up everywhere. One of the difficulties there is this strange gap between the best thinkers and the actual projects, right? I want to see John Vervaeke cutting firewood in my community, something like that, right? You want to see that there's some kind of normal fissure, and very often it's just the social tendency that you want to hang out with the people that you like and work on the projects you want to work on. But emotionally, we have to close that gap somehow so that there's really good advanced thinking going on with the people who are trying to set up the survive and thrive and daily life improvement projects, and that the really good thinkers are putting a lot of their time and energy into actual physical on the ground, even mundane seeming projects that set up structures that allow us to live now and in an unstable future.
Yeah, my only follow-up to that is it's funny. So Jason and I have this Doomer Optimism podcast, and we're like basically the whole podcast is like talking to people who are navigating this, and Substack. And something that seems to be in common is that like a lot of people have talked about the role of psychedelics in getting them to like navigate the reality that we're faced with giving them tools to like appreciate life, but also to like, you know, I don't know, it's almost like navigating the light and the darkness, like see what to be drawn toward, and appreciate nature and connection to community, and like see those things for what they are. And I don't know if you've ever heard of this author Tucker Max, but he was like I don't know, he did a, what was it called, Jason? What did the New York Times call his writing? I don't remember. Anyways, it was like salacious writing about sexual exploits. And then he like did many months of psychedelic therapy, and now he's like a sustainable rancher and a family man, and like experimenting with that. And I don't know, I just think that there's something really curious about that arc in the modern problem, because I loved so much about what you were saying in your presentation about like, let's go back to the 12th century, let's go back to the 1950s, like this obsession with trying to come up with some perfect time in the past to go back to. And I think like we do actually just need to navigate a very messy way forward. And yeah, psychedelics could be helpful with that.
Psychedelics are a very interesting set of tools because they, depending on which ones you're looking at, they do a number of things simultaneously, right? The small dose enhancement of our ability to perform everyday tasks through microdosing is interesting. The connection between these substances and our local environments, the parallels between the structures we see in nature and the kinds of structures that come forth in psychedelic experience, and the use of these as re-imprinting or as educational update tools, right? In the 60s, they put a lot of work into thinking of these as imprint technologies. And one way to think about imprinting technologies is it tells your brain at a subconscious level what the world is that you're existing in at the moment, where you receive the imprint. And a lot of us get imprints early on in life, and we don't get new ones for the rest of our life. And a lot of the ones we receive come from cultural periods in the past that may not be up to speed. So one of the things we're going to have to do as things change faster and faster is find any tools that help us get up to speed more quickly. And these very well might be a huge, weapon in that arsenal, so to speak.
Awesome. Thank you, Ashley. And I just love and a huge supporter of what Jason and Ashley are doing. And I think doomer optimism, like two things, is like one, it's like an attractor that can like house many things beyond homesteading, and I think it will, like psychedelics. And two, I think it's a good onboarding vehicle for normies. I think the doomer optimism is going to be like a space that people can go to instead of like all this like weirdo meta stuff that we geek about here.
Yeah, happy to come on and talk with you guys anytime.
Yeah, so definitely check out their Doomer Optimism podcast. Cadell last. You had a question or share.
Sure. Hey, Layman. And I also really appreciated your talk. My guess, some of what I wanted to say was already kind of approached already in what's been asked to you. But I wanted to highlight something specifically from your article that interested me on a personal level. You say, if you follow this Substack account or participate in one or more liminal web communities, there's a good chance you can be an apocalyptarian. And you go on and on about this, and then say, however, most folks are not like you. Across this country and around the world, even your own family, people will be slipping into reciprocal forms of mass psychosis. And the dominant feeling for me in my sort of experience in this space is that there can be this huge chasm between these people that you can have great connections with online and building new community with, and there's a lot of opportunity there. But the ability to just connect with family, or family just thinking, not really understanding you or not knowing how to connect with people. Like, so for example, I was staying with my aunt last summer and her neighbor came over and we were just talking, and I actually sent her some of my blog posts on psychedelics, and it kind of scared her shitless. And she actually stopped talking to me after that. Like, so she like, how do you, like, I basically am asking a question of this navigating an ethical gap where I feel like I was embedded in a life world, I was embedded in a family system, and then by becoming embedded in this larger weird liminal space. There's a huge cultural gap. I'm not sure if what I'm pointing at there is clear, but
yeah, there's a lot of dimensions to that, and nice to see you again, by the way. I think one of the things we look to families for is a kind of connectedness that can hold a lot of tension, right? We're establishing through unconscious factors and through inherited performances a system in which you can have huge disagreements with people, but also give them a place to stay if they need it, right? It's sort of the ideal of family, is they can handle that. So we need to be thinking in terms of how we can, yes, work with the existing ones that we have, but figure out what those mechanisms are that allow relationships between people to deepen to the point where they're actually supportive instantiations in the world. I think that's especially important if the informational and ontological pressure on people is going to get to the point where you're going to lose a little more family than maybe you did in the past under similar conditions. Right. I'm pretty blessed with most of my family, but I've got a couple of estranged characters who I wouldn't necessarily want to be in their bunker, so to speak. Right. So in order to substitute for that, which is the normal ancient way to build a set of connections that you can rely upon, even if you don't agree with people, we have to be able to somehow figure out what those growing together mechanisms are at a subconscious level so we can instantiate those. And part of that, maybe part of both of those solutions, is a little bit like the integral thinking, right? I think that we need to be able to recognize general types of people and adapt our communication to a couple different styles, right? When you go to see Granny, you're not necessarily talking to someone who might be adapted to modern or postmodern or metamodern discourse. You may have to have a good sense of what traditional folk discourse is in order to make sense with her, right? And there may be lots of kinds of things that people can hear. They just need a slightly different phrasing. We don't know what the limits of that are. Some people, it's going to be too much, but I think we have a lot more wiggle room than we usually think in terms of knowing different dialects for communicating our same ideas. And then there's just a lot of the basic spiritual skills, which is, how do you not exacerbate communication? How do you continue to love people even though they're saying nonsense or seem to be hostile or things like that? There's a lot of just basic practice skills that we have and spaces we can create in order to bypass at least the worst parts of that. You know, and just like our immune system often causes more damage than the disease it's fighting off, we have to make sure if there's a friction problem with people that we're not causing more of a problem by a reaction to it than it's being caused by the problem itself. But of all those things I just said, I think the most important one is collectively starting to clarify what the procedures are for building deep community and deep relationships with people that can get to the level of security that we previously looked to family for.
yeah, I think that last point hits pretty strong. Just my thought here on this point is that it would be very interesting to see more conversations about family and intimacy in, I think, the metamodern space, because that's the ground of community. So thank you for that. Yeah.
You know, I'll share something here because I put a lot of thought into this and practice. It's like I was a trainer at Dale Carnegie training before I did all this kind of like online stuff, and it's just the rule there is meet someone at where they're at. And then like he's like a really brilliant guy. This is one of his like this golden rule book, and he was like a brilliant guy. He read so much, all the wisdom literature, but he just cut the epistemic fat in like plain language that people can like, and it works. It's like a likability literacy when you kind of learn this tech. And there's almost like learning how to speak a primordial language, like the language of intuition, emotions. And if you can kind of like use your memes in such a way that kind of like that Venn diagram of your each other's minds, I think that is the spot, and speak to that more primordial language. But I do think this is an art form that kind of like we got to get good at. Brendan, you had a question. Brendan had an awesome presentation at the Stoa Medic Tribes on.
Yeah, and I was just typing out a better way of phrasing it too. And anyways, I'll just didn't quite finish it, but there you go. Yeah, so among the different mimetic tribes in which we are embedded in alternating fashion within our lives, these liminal ideas and practices can be held in sincerity and in irony, depending on the context. Some of these can be presented to within so-called normie contexts, so that these people might embrace and be inspired to somehow improve their lives and their community, in their world. And then at the same time, we shouldn't take these things too seriously. We can occasionally hang out in Pascal's integral bat cave and kind of poke fun at these ideas, because we can't shouldn't be thinking that they are the whole solution. And doing that helps us kind of refine things. And so I just want to make that comment. Maybe you could riff on that.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. There's different modes and different moments for handling these things. And if we're all creative and we're all complex, then we're all likely to be emphasizing something at a given time that might seem like it deserves a counterbalancing, which maybe it doesn't. Like even in the article I just read, I'm leaning into something on purpose. I'm being slightly hyperbolic in order to bring forward a quality for us to process. It doesn't always have to have that feeling quality. But I think it really is important to be able to be both serious and light. And the light part has an extra dimension to it. It's not just about the fun and humor and letting yourself off the seriousness. It's also about building cultural anti-fragility, right? So the meme hive there, the bat cave. One of the things it's doing is, we don't have to take ourselves so seriously all the time. But another thing is, let's expose ourselves to the chaos of this. Let's try things that upset our own idea systems, right? It's one of the things we're doing on the Integral Stage podcast is, how much are we going to risk here? Who are we going to have on? How upsetting can we be? How you get in this position where you're wondering what you're going to do when an even stronger wave of negative feedback lashes out at you from the internet. And that to me symbolizes this fact that we have to be willing to risk a lot of cultural turbulence, which is going to emotionally affect us and challenge things that we think are really serious and important or even sacred. And we have to be willing to do that because we don't know what we're going to face next. What we do know is we're going to need complexity and resilience and the ability to get better at benefiting from chaos, from strife, from disagreements, from the tension between perspectives. So we've got to really expose ourselves to that chaos as much as we can in order to turn it into a skill so that this community is resilient facing all the things it's going to face going forward.
Any follow-up share, Brendan? You're on mute. No? Okay. Stephen, you had yeah, sure.
Sure. Thanks. So I know it's early days for you, but I just wonder if you had thoughts on how this would scale up and, if it would require institutions to do that.
Yeah, that is the big question. I've been having a lot of discussions with Raveki on how we scale these things up. There'll be different ways of thinking about that. Scale is an interesting question because it has some built-in divisions within itself. Like we might say there's a left and a right or something like that, right? There might be a right-leaning tendency, which is we've got to set up local communities. We've got to be setting up our civiums and our game beehives and things like that, instantiating local versions to see it. Well, we don't know how big it can get, but slightly bigger than a couple of individuals would be a good start, setting something up that's practical. But the other side of that, the left-leaning side, is we also have to try to manipulate as much of the existing big scale structures as possible, right? There are some very basic kinds of shifts that if they could be legislatively implemented might make all of these things a lot easier or a lot worse. So when we think about scale, part of it's building up, which is partly experimental and partly something we can anticipate. And then on the other hand, there are already processes operating at scales, and how can we infiltrate those and use those in ways which will be beneficial to what we all see and feel is going on here. Institutions will be necessary, especially if we have to end up defending things that we're working on going forward. But I think we all need to be aware of the limitations of the kinds of institutions that our species has traditionally built. We've often set up things that are no good when situations change. So whatever we set up has to be more flexible, more adaptable, more anti-fragile, better able to generate higher levels of collaborative and collective intelligence, right? Unless we can outthink other scaled up operations that might be disagreeing with us or even trying to predate or parasitize us, then we're not going to do very well. We have to be thinking, how can we be stable and secure and set up a larger institution that is flexible and adaptive and able to generate better collective conclusions out of our many individual intelligences than other similar kinds of systems. So I would be looking very much at the information exchange and collective decision-making protocols. I'd be looking very much at things like the kind of structures Vervaeke lays out as the basis of cognition, like how do you get adaptive optimal grip at each of the layers in the system? How do you prevent unnecessary forms of hierarchy from forming, especially those ones that cause a decreasing amount of information to flow toward the decision makers, right? That's a really big problem. We have kind of classical ways of talking about that, right? The Peter principle, promote people to their level of incompetence. Also this thing from Robert Anton Wilson, which was called Salin's law, which is if people above you in a system can decide things that affect you and your family, then you can't give them full information because there's too much of a risk. Well, what that means is the further up the status hierarchy you go, the less informed the people are. And you end up with a system where the most powerful people with most decision-making capacity know the least about what's going on. So there's all these sort of basic unfolding problems in collective intelligence that we've seen play out over human history. And we have to make sure that whatever institutions we set up, which we will need to do, that they avoid and bypass those at least well-known problems of collective and personal cognitive bias.
Any follow-up, share?
No, that's good. Thanks.
Cool. So we'll maybe have one more question. I think I need a nap after this. Lisa, you had a share question.
Yeah, I need a nap too. Thank you, Layman. This is just so wonderful. And I think the sincere irony is just the medicine for right now. I don't have a question, I guess more of a comment that I just wanted to share that I think that doomer optimism and the Stoa and many of these other spaces are the ways that we're currently already in the experiment. And it sounds like the Ontario Depth Adaptation Group is really, boots on the ground. I think we need so much more of that. The more experimentation, the better. I'm very randomly mobile right now. I'm more like looking for where I can take root. But I just wanted to share that there's nothing coming up for me in language, but I think maybe a stretch for all of us might be, how does the very well practiced and articulated spaces like the Stoa take the next step in terms of institution, as Layman was just saying about institution building, even in the sense of what a Zoom call is or what a collective virtual telepresence can be or should be. So how would we begin to, I would say, remain in the experiment rather than always thinking it at arm's length? So I'll just share that thought. Thank you all.
Yeah, thanks, Lisa. That's a really good inquiry, especially for virtual spaces. Like we know one of the things we have to do is get out of virtual spaces, right? You got to come together with other people in real space because there's so much other communication that goes on, and that's the prerequisite for community. But given that we have all these virtual spaces, is there anything else we can do with them besides listen to each other opine and then share commentary? One of the things we might think about doing is creating targets, right? Like what builds community is things you have to take care of, right? We've got to get water or something like that. Very often these spaces are extremely open-ended. What's the purpose of today's discussion? There isn't really one, right? But even if we set a simple purpose like let's come to a decision collectively about X, right? That would require something different from our sharing. It would be a little bit more like what it has to be when you're on the ground in some sort of ecological system you have to adapt to. So it may be that there are ways we can harness ourselves toward particular targets or narrow design spaces and tell ourselves that we have to come to a conclusion, knowing it won't be the perfect conclusion, but we can task ourselves to coordinate in a way that might be at least a half a next step.
Awesome. Maybe I'll take in a final question. It's one of the many amazing skills and talents you have, Layman, is like this escape velocity meta. So you're like, your perspective is like, like top of the game. And so related to what you just said, is there anything like you specifically would like to see, like either the Stoa or adjacent spaces like Doom or Optimism or players in the liminal web do, or conversations that need to have here, just like selfishly and maybe selflessly?
Well, one thing that's on my mind lately, and Bruce Alderman's trying to set up an integral stage ritual around the apocalyptarian sentiment for March 20th, and people can check that out. But that's an interesting other kind of thing, is that we come together and all collectively do something at the same moment in our spaces in ways that involve physicality, involve the unconscious, involve emotion, maybe involve magic, whatever that is. I think those are some things that the Stoa might be able to play a role in, sort of organizing distributed ritual moments. But also, I think somebody mentioned gut bacteria between human and animals in one of the comments earlier. For me personally, I want to hear a lot more about diet, about eating, about, right? That's at the center of a lot of our sense making, a lot of our system building, a lot of our personal health. Adi Da had this famous comment that a lot of your spiritual problems are really just lunch. So if there was a little bit more focus on people who could bring forward ideas in those very basic human biological spaces, but do it with a meta level intelligence, I'd like to see a lot more of that.
Yeah, it's really cool. And there's like a lot of synchronicity happening around rituals here, just for my life. And got these books. So this book kicked my ass, Byung-Chul Han's Disappearance of Rituals. I highly recommend it. I got all these like normie books too on ritual design, like Rituals for Work, which is really fucking good tech that can be repurposed. So I think ritual game is something I definitely want to lean into personally at the Stoa. And I think everyone's kind of feeling something similar. So we'll close out here. Layman, my friend, thank you so much for such a brilliant presentation. I imagine people want that slide deck and those memes, like that's like a lifetime of memeing out there. And yeah, I'll make no announcements, but there's a lot of cool events coming up at thestoa.ca. And everyone, thank you so much for coming to the Stoa today.
Yeah, this is fantastic. I think, who knows how doomed we really are, but all these kinds of people that I'm seeing, these are the kinds of people I would put my trust in.
Amen.
Thank you so much. Thanks.